Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Arthur B. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College and the University of Manitoba. My name is Dr. Adam Muller, the acting director of the Morrow Institute and a professor of peace studies. I welcome you here today for today's lecture. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and in the homeland of the MHA Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you for attending today. This is the first of our winter term brown bag lectures. Please visit our website to see descriptions and find registration links and recordings for future lectures, and also to find links to video recordings of past lectures. Today's lecture is taking place both in person and online, so welcome to those of you who are attending online as well. And the lecture is being recorded for future broadcast on the Morrow Institute YouTube channel. The lecture will include a 30 to 40 minute presentation followed by a question and answer session. Online viewers are asked to type their questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom platform, please. Our lecturer today is Dr. Michael Yellowbird, Dean of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. Michael Yellowbird is an enrolled member of the MHA Nation, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara in North Dakota. His research focuses on the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, ancestral health, intermittent fasting, Indigenous mindfulness, Neuro-decolonization, mindful decolonization, and the cultural significance of Red Dot. He's the founder, director, and principal investigator for the Center for Mindful Decolonization and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. He serves as a consultant trainer and senior advisor to several BIPOC mindfulness groups and organizations who are seeking to incorporate mindfulness practices, philosophies, and activities to indigenize and decolonize Western mindfulness approaches in order to address systemic racism and engage in structural change. Today, Dr. Yellowbird will share a history of decolonizing social work that dates back to 1979, when he was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He will discuss his academic work, writings, and efforts to decolonize social work practice and education over the last 45 years as an Indigenous social work scholar, leader, and administrator. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Yellowbird to the Brown Bag Lecture Podium. Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I just say in my language, Nawat, did you wake on the phone? Nawat, you wake on it, went Zagarich, so I'll just offer good thanks and glad to be here. Hope your families are well. Sending all of these good thoughts to your ancestors and those yet to come, these words there. I want to go ahead and just jump into this because I always have a tendency to over-prepare. So I'm going to start just by talking about what decolonization is, and there's several definitions. And this particular one comes from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Colonial, freeing a people, freeing themselves really, from colonial status, to relinquish control of subjugated people of the area, and so on. You can read it all yourself. The country faces international pressure to decolonize territory, and of course, to be free from dominating influences by the colonizing power. That's a big order, to get out of the influence of a colonizing power. We live very staunchly within and embedded in colonizing society. So Morris Julius Bond is credited with creating the colonization even before it was coined by the United Nations, to describe colonies that were achieving self-governance and many struggles for the independence, and some were very armed and very bloody, which they became again at different points in time in history. My own background is I come from North Dakota. That's my territory. This particular picture is a very clear picture of colonization in the Turtle Island. Sometimes I don't say Canada and the United States. I use the term Turtle Island because before there was a Canada and the United States, that Indigenous people moved freely back and forth, just like they did in Mexico. These are children that ended up at called Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and I have relatives in this group. Many of us do, and these were children that were taken for many years from different cultures across the Turtle Island in the United States, right? So I'm kind of one of those descendants of these folks. A little bit about me, the early years of colonization. I was born in the mid-1950s, and what happened during the 1950s is that the United States government, through their Army Corps of Engineers, began this whole process of inundating indigenous lands, for the use of to create dams and to create, recreation and that sort of thing. That picture on the bottom is our reservation. They call them reserves up here in California. They call them rancherias, and communities and that sort of thing. So they're pretty much the same. And as you see that, all the blue in there is the river, the lake that flooded out our territories. And within all that blue, we had a number of different villages and a number of different kinds of sacred sites. People interacted there, people lived there. That was, the lifestyle was very much tied yet to the land. People were hunter-gatherers, but also they were farmers. And prior to that, prior to colonization, our people played a very important role. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara played a very important role in trade that came all the way up to northern Manitoba, all the way down to Mexico. So if you look at the trade routes on Turtle Island, you will see that the three tribes were very prolific in terms of their agricultural growing of foods. We traded a lot of corn, a lot of beans, a lot of squash, tobacco, all those kinds of things. We traded, with the Crees and the Ojibwe up here. They had pelts, they had guns they got from the French, so we traded for that. That market then would go over to the Cheyennes, who were further west or further south to the Lakota and Dakota people, or maybe out east to the Anishinaabe people. So it was very centralized and very active part of the world before colonization. I call it the Indigenous Silk Road because there was so much activity that was moving back and forth through that time. But as colonization happened, this is a testimony from Martin Cross, who was one of our tribal leaders back in 1949. He talked about, this is not the first time that the public interest has sought to acquire the lands, and not really acquire, but just take the lands of the indigenous people in our community. And it was done before all these different times, and it goes down, we're down from like 9 million acres of land that was promised to us in treaties, down to, he was talking about 600,000 acres. Well, after that, we lost an additional 155,000 acres when they flooded out the rest of our territory. There's really nothing that we could do about it. There were treaties. The government said to us, we're going to flood your land. We're going to pay you this much. Take it or leave it. And that's what's known as the plenary power of the United States government. They have the complete authority over tribal folks in the United States. They still do. In the Congress of the United States, if the Congress decided tomorrow they were going to wipe out all the tribes, and we still call ourselves tribes in the States, wipe out all the 570 tribes in the United States, all they'd have to do is sign on the dotted line and say, we no longer recognize you as, as tribal folks or as Native Americans. You are therefore part of the general population. So the top picture there is a delegation of our tribal leaders there. And this guy, Kruger, who was part of the Army Corps of Engineers through the federal government, was signing. They had to sign away their land to the government. They were forced to sign away. So you see one guy very emotional in tears. That's one of my grandfathers. His name was George Gillette. You can find that picture all over the internet, right? If you look for it, the Fort Berthold Reservation and the flooding. And of course, his expression was that, we had this treaty with the United States government. As long as the grass grows, the wind blows, and the sky is blue, you promised this. We did everything you told us to do. Right? And now, the treaties that we had with you, the agreements we had with you, it's all just, up in smoke. And so, of course, they were very attached to their land. And they broke down in tears. You look at all the somber faces of people in there. That's when you start talking about relationship with the land and the power of colonization. So many of us Indigenous people, Indigenous scholars don't think of colonization as like colonizing, your institution or colonizing your property or colonizing yoga or anything like that. We're talking about a nation-to-nation status between Indigenous people and the colonizing government. So that's one of the things about colonization, decolonization, is those terms have been co-opted to kind of represent something different than representing what Indigenous people feel, in terms of the colonization. I'm going to kind of speed forward because I'm not going to talk about all my years in BIA schools and my years in Catholic boarding school, which were very challenging to say the least. But I'll talk to you about some of the early influences that I had. When I was a senior in high school at St. Mary's boarding school in North Dakota, I first read Vine Deloria's book, Custer Died for Your Sins. I was punished by my nun teacher and sent to Sister Frances Marie, who was the principal, and told me how to go down to the church and say, like, I don't know, a million Hail Marys and, a billion Our Fathers or whatever. So I go down there, but my sister had sent me this book. She was a member of the American Indian movement out in the Bay Area in the late 1960s. She had gone from our reservation to UCLA on a scholarship. She did really well in school. She was very, very gifted, not like me, I struggled in school, but she was very, very gifted. So she was reading all this literature and sending it back, to my older brother, and I would, grab it sometimes. So I had this book here. But how it influenced my thinking around decolonization is that for the first time in print, I saw as a high school student, a very strong critique around laws and treaties that had affected our people, as Indigenous people. Over 400 treaties that had been broken. The Native American had kept their obligations, but the U.S. had not. And of course, at that point, we were talking, very freely in the academy about the lack of integrity of the federal government. Deloria had several chapters in here. I just wanted to kind of just highlight a couple. The second one was Red and Black, and he talked about how African American and Indigenous peoples striving for freedom and liberation were tied to one another. And he said, but there were differences as well too. But also, what he's saying here though is that, the keeping away of black people from American society was deliberate because they had nothing to offer American society. Now they wanted to integrate Indigenous people into white society in the U.S. because they had something, and that was the land. And it reminds me of my friend Tayagi Alford, who has written a book called It's All About the Land. He just wrote that book very recently. I didn't get a chance to put it in this thing, so I just wanted to mention it. So when I was probably like 13 years old or so, two of my sisters who were living out in the Bay Area then, they were very heavily involved with the American Indian movement. And also, my oldest sister used to go from UCLA to Berkeley, to travel over to Berkeley to sit in Angela Davis's class. Now, Angela Davis is a very famous Black Panther back in the U.S. So she used to write letters home about all the things she was learning. She was an undergraduate student at UCLA. So they got involved, and both of them ended up on Alcatraz Island at one point, And the sister who was younger than her, but older than me, sent home a picture one time of herself where she was and other Native people were going out to Alcatraz Island because they had taken it away from the government, and just off the bay of San Francisco. So they were in the boat, they were getting ready to launch. And the picture she sent was in the San Francisco Examiner, I think. And she was all surrounded by these boats that were, from military boats surrounding her, Coast Guard. And they had all their guns drawn on them, so the photographer took a picture of her, and all the food is in there. So my sister's looking up at the camera, and she sent it home. Of course, it's like 1969, right? And sent it. We didn't have cell phones, so we didn't even have a phone, so it came when my parents got it at breakfast and my mom opened it up, she just goes, she just has gasped, you know, and like, what are they doing out there? Of course, we knew what they were doing out there. But we knew because my father was involved in tribal politics too. He'd gone to Washington many times. So to me, these were kind of all about the decolonization, and it goes really deep in my family. I was also just a year out of high school then, when Wounded Knee took place in South Dakota, which was really, really a big deal at that time. There was an occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota for 71 days. Some of the indigenous people were killed by military and police snipers, and it was a big national incident. It was the first time that indigenous people in a long time had, had this resistance against the government. Again, another form of decolonization as part of that resistance. And Wounded Knee was about, the sovereign rights of indigenous people, not just people at Wounded Knee, not just the Lakota people, but all these intertribal people were there at Wounded Knee fighting for recognition for sovereignty. 1973, the Indian Religious Freedom Act wasn't passed until 1978. It was against the law in the United States for us to practice our religion. The law had to be passed. The Indian Child Welfare Act, where we could protect our children from the social workers and the government and missionaries, wasn't passed until 1978. But the numbers still are there. So it was about the neglect that was happening, and of course there was an armed struggle back and forth. The government came down and they negotiated with the people. They gave some concessions, but things were back to normal, or back to status quo after a short period of time. So when I was at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and the graduate social work programs, probably when I really started getting an understanding of what decolonization was. And I was there in 1979 to 1980. The man you see there is Ronald G. Lewis. He was known as the father of Indian or Indigenous social work in the United States. He was my professor. He was the first Indigenous professor I had. And he was at Wounded Knee. He was at Alcatraz Island. So when he came into the classroom, and I was sitting there, and he starts talking about his experience at Wounded Knee and Alcatraz Island, where there was all this struggle. I said, oh, this guy's got street cred. This guy's legit. He's not going to come in and just talk about theory and that sort of stuff. I'd never been there. So that, to me, was a very powerful statement around decolonization. The first time I heard the term decolonization is when he raised it in one of our classes, talking about the United Nations, movement and their towards decolonization of countries that were occupied by Great Britain, and France, and in China or in Africa, those kinds of places. And that decolonization was kind of at this global level at that point. So Ron talked about that, and Professor Lewis, I should say, talked about that in class. And he talked about sovereignty. He talked about indigenous people's rights. He talked about the importance of us, maintaining our culture, our ceremonies, and social work practice should be all about the focus on, who we are as indigenous people and culture. And that one of the most important things about decolonization was, again, restoration of our land rights. As you saw in the United States government, as Martin Cross was talking about, we're down to 6,000 acres from 12,000 acres. I think it was the original one, but thousands of acres have just taken away. So he said those are the struggles we need to involve ourselves in. He didn't talk about going out there and working with people, and impoverished and so on. He said we have what we need to take care of some of those things, in our community, because we have our particular kinds of social relationships, our different kinds of ways that we interacted. Those things have been, time tested, he said. So what we need to do is be activists out there to go and to claim and to fight and to try to overturn colonization. And he was very clear that colonization was a thing with the indigenous people against the invasion of the settler governments. So I'm kind of skipping ahead a lot here, but after I finished graduate school, I finished my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, or Madison, I should say. My first teaching job was at the University of British Columbia at UBC. So this is where I first started introducing decolonizing social work to my students. That's me there when I was a bit younger, but and my students, actually black hair and long hair at the time. But I was really influenced a lot, not only by Vine Deloria, but some of the classic folks like Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire and some of those folks who were, and, Albert Memmi, all these people who were writing about colonization and decolonization. So another early influencer was a Canadian, well, I should say, Indigenous person from Turtle Island from here, and that was Howard Adams. Some of you may have seen this book. How many people have seen it? Not all. Okay, couple. That's, if you want to understand colonization in Canada, this was a very influential book. So I used it in my class, at UBC, and students were shocked by the things that Howard Adams had to say about, Canada being this colonizing power that oppressed Indigenous and Aboriginal people. And that's why he called it the tortured people, right? The deeply rooted issues behind the dramatic increase in the resistance of Indigenous people, right? So it was really important, and this is one of the things I got into a bit of trouble as an assistant professor. I would talk about the importance of revolution, the importance of resistance, the importance of standing your ground. And it was very foreign to students because they were coming into social work, not with that in mind. They were coming in to help the poor Indian people, or the poor Indigenous people, right? If people are suffering, you've got to help you. And so he said, well, you can help me by helping me get my land back. It was very foreign concept to people. Help me to get my water, cleaned up, that your government polluted. Help me to get back my land so I can, return to a traditional life. Help me to do those kinds of things. But that was not in the wheelhouse of social work, right? So these kinds of things were being introduced at that time, and they're still not at that level either. So there may be other things that are written about decolonization in the academy, but I think one of the most influential books, on decolonizing decolonization is Linda Tua Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, and her discussion about Maori culture and, of course, changing, research methods and supporting, Indigenous or Maori scholarship was very important, and these research methods, should be implemented, right? So I think she's up to her third edition now. There's a 2023. This book came out, I think, in 1999 originally, and then in 2002, sorry. And then in 2023, I think the third edition is out. So a lot of people cite this work, right? When I was at California, when I was a professor out there at Cal Poly, at the Cal Poly School of Humboldt, I instituted a decolonization statement and a decolonization curriculum for them. And this is my statement I wrote. These are our students that were going out to Indigenous territory and respectfully attending, and participating in some of the ceremony here, but seeing the different kinds of things. Like this is, I think it's Yurok, smoke. One of the houses they use for ceremonies. I can't remember the name of what they call it, but students would go out there and they were learning about the traditions of the people and why these traditions were so important to the people in terms of their healing, and that social workers should begin to provide some kind of support and protection of these sacred areas and try to help the Indigenous people reclaim their land. Right? We don't have textbooks or curriculum that teaches students to go out and do that, so they're coached then by folks out there in the community. So this definition, though, is really about privileging and supporting sovereignty, well-being, cultural, spiritual, and land rights of Indigenous people. We don't normally think about that in social work, land rights being a very critical part of the work that we do. Working with Indigenous people to implement traditional practices and philosophies for the contemporary context that are going to be healing and that sort of thing. So this was the thing I was trying to do in my work, is trying to influence different social work programs that I was associated with in schools and so on, to begin to think about decolonization. This was probably back in 2012 or 2013. So publications, the first publication, major publication I had, co-edited a book with my sister Waziatu, and we did this book for Indigenous Eyes Only back in 2005. So it was shortly after Linda Toohey Smith had published her Decolonizing Methodologies. Now this was outside of social work because social work wasn't very receptive to decolonizing methodologies or anything. So we had to do this through Indigenous studies. So for part of my career, I've been an Indigenous studies scholar as well. Through this book, we really talk about what colonization is, and sort of really kind of talk about the importance of decolonization. That has to take place in a person's mind first, and I think can't quite see it from here. So as you read it, you'll see that that's one of the things is that decolonization. The first place it happens is in the mind, because the mind of the colonizer, as long as the colonizer has the mind of the people are controlled. So liberation of the mind was critical. That's the first thing, of course, that's been mentioned by other decolonization scholars earlier. This was not really meant for academic consumption. And you see the activities in there, the lines in there. We wrote this book to directly talk to Indigenous communities, to hand this book out. In the American School of Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, helped us do that. They wanted to publish this. But we sent hundreds and hundreds of books to different Indigenous communities so that they could do activities and they could work. Once they read about the colonization, decolonization, they wouldn't have to go to the university and sit through hours or hours. They would just sit there and they would write examples of colonization and decolonization. Right? So this was very community driven, which I think decolonization is all about. Let's see here. The second book that I worked on and co-edited was a book called Indigenous Social Work Around the World. Well, let me go back to this. For Indigenous Eyes Only, it actually won, was nominated for a big book prize in the Southwest, because people found it very, very provocative in the community, right? Never got much traction in the academy. But interestingly enough, I go around and I see that book still on different shelves at different Indigenous programs and stuff around Turtle Island. So the second book we did was called Indigenous Social Work Around the World. And it was another decolonization publication that I did with Mel Gray, who is a scholar from Australia, and John Coates, who is a scholar from St. Thomas University in Canada. The contributions for this book, for me, were looking at social work in terms of what would be the ideal, what would be the exemplar of Indigenous social work. So I wrote a job description on there and talked about the need and the requirements and responsibilities. When I had my students at Cal Poly read this book, they were mad. They got really mad. In particular, they were very mad at me because they thought I was suggesting that social work should be working towards sending all the white people back to Europe, right? And I said, well, how did you get that? How did you get that out of that? And sort of they were talking. Well, not all of them. A bunch of them were with me. Some of them was a very local group, and that was one of the things I realized, that it was very difficult for Indigenous scholars in the academy that were going to talk about things that were not embraced by white society or white politics, where the dominant imperial discourse and the narrative, right? It's not part of that. And it's in particular the United States, who treats itself with American exceptionalism, right? When you challenge that with these kinds of publications, students will fight back, and they'll report you to the dean. I happen to be the dean now, but they used to report me to the dean, right? So, but that was it was another publication. So this is another one we did where it's called, and as you notice too, that this one here, back here, these are called handbooks. So you see that, a decolonization handbook under Indigenous Eyes Only. And then we got back to the second series, which was for Indigenous Minds Only. For the first one, it was funny because when we wrote this book, we did this book, and people would actually come up to me and say, and there'd be white people and say, is it okay if I read this book? Because it's for Indigenous Eyes Only, right? I said, well, it's just the title, right? It's kind of that kind of thing. So, but people were really serious. You guys aren't laughing, but I was fine. There you go. And then when we did the second go around here, which was Indigenous Minds Only, Then we begin to focus a lot more on the colonization of the mind. We talk about decolonization in all these different kinds of ways, but in this book is where I introduce the concept of neurodecolonization, which I do a lot of right now. That's a big part of the study that I do. I work with Indigenous communities. I still do, even as a dean. I push myself to make sure that I work directly with Indigenous communities. You know, I don't feel even though I'm too busy, or I never feel like I'm too busy to do that. This was, interestingly, a winner of a Choice Outstanding Academic Title. We won that in 2014, and you know, it was surprising to me, but I think to all of us when we put the book together, because it was a very provocative book, and it was very challenging. But Choice Magazine, Choice titles are supposed to be the best of the best, so we realized that, you know, decolonization that was becoming important to people, that they were reading it, right? So does this have it doesn't have a laser on there.
It does, yeah.
Does it? Doesn't work for me. It's probably because I'm Indigenous. It won't work. I don't see it. It's not working. That's okay. But if you see decolonization seeks to weaken the effects of colonialism and create opportunities, is something that I was writing about, and so it became part of this book. And establishing language and cultural programs, honoring land claims, teaching Indigenous history and science and ways of knowing, you know, and self-esteem programs. All these things were around decolonization. As you can see there, Indigenous people have a very different definition, operationally definition than people who are using decolonization now. Most time, I've seen so many books that mention decolonization that never ever mention Indigenous people. Decolonizing yoga, decolonizing the church, decolonizing whatever it is. So it's kind of, that term has been appropriated, right? It's become, I think, with some, I'm trying to remember the authors there, what they call it's a metaphor now, right? This is another publication we finished over the pandemic. So this book was again really focusing on decolonization and thinking about, you know, things like you know, social memory and memory work, about getting Indigenous people to do that memory work and communities to do that memory work of what's happened, and of course to kind of restore themselves, right? Not to forget, you know, also how balanced and how, you know, what their strengths were back in the past, not just the trauma, right? And so we looked at that and looked at contemplative traditions and storytelling and healing literatures and so on. This book is taken off pretty well. We have a forthcoming book now with another author, Michael Wallegren Lynch. He's an Irish scholar. So I'm learning a lot about Irish history and colonization and decolonization. Also, through my 23andMe, I learned I was 2% Irish, so I have an Irish brother. So, this is a forthcoming book we're working on really now. This book, we're really looking at the big picture. We're talking about the doomsday clock. Have you ever heard of the doomsday clock? Write it down. Read about the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock is this metaphor, this symbol, where these scientists get together and talk about the collapse of humanity, right? And the things that can bring about the collapse: nuclear war, pandemics, you know, climate change, and there's a number of other, you know, like economic crash, and AI happens to be one of them too, artificial intelligence. So we're trying to kind of bring this to the awareness of social work students and say, let's see if we can get ahead of this stuff. Let's see if we can, you know, bring this into our awareness. And our publisher, Rutledge, has been very faithful, because we've been very slow to turn this one out. And that's kind of it's been mostly my fault as a dean, sitting there and not getting enough writing time. So that one's coming. And one of the papers that I did back in 2004 was called Cowboys and Indians, Toys of Genocide, Icons of Colonialism. This paper I did back then really got a lot of hits and continues to. And this book talks all about, you know, how colonization of Indigenous people have happened in so many ways. what I use is the metaphor here is the toy cowboys and Indians, if you've ever seen those. They sell them in the stores. I don't know if they still sell. I don't know if they do in Canada, but I'm sure you could find them. But in the States, they were very widespread. They had little red Indians and little blue cowboys, right? And I wrote about that and said, gosh, you know, just imagine if you could go to a store, you know, and you could find Jewish Holocaust prisoners and Nazi guards, right? And kids could play with those, or kids could play with, you know, black folks and their slave masters, right? So I was trying to say this is how Indigenous people have been selected in settler society to be focused on, to make sure that, you know, they knew they were conquered, right? So I talked about this paper in that way, you know, and it wasn't unusual to me, but I did get a lot of calls from professors when I was on the campus at Arizona State and the University of Kansas, where I was a professor at both places. Professors in sociology and psychology, they would call me. Are listening to me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Your call is causing radio interference.
I can just go out and hear this up.
That might be the FBI. Get out of here. So this, you know, was interesting because when, after a while, I started getting calls from students threatening and, you know, very, very disturbed that I would make a comparison to these different groups and Indigenous people and the circumstances of oppression they were under. Right? They would call me and they were going to come to my office and they were going to, like, you know, give me the business and stuff. So Ward Churchill, maybe most of you don't know Ward Churchill's history or his story. But I just wanted to tell this very quickly because I cite him in a lot of my work back then. Ward was a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, very prolific Indigenous and ethnic studies professor. A lot of number of books and publications that he had. You know, it's just you know, just out of the park. So he published a lot of stuff in critique of the U.S. policy in the Middle East, U.S. policy against Native Americans, and so on. And after 9/11 in the United States had happened, he wrote an article the day after and published it called "Some People, the Chickens Come Home to Roost, Some People Fight Back." And he talked about how the attack on the World Trade Center on this innocent American world was the result of the U.S. policies in the Middle East and the policies that were implemented in Iraq, which had caused the death of 500,000 children, babies, toddlers, and kids, and because of the sanctions and then the war that was against Iraq, and of course how people struck back at the U.S. because of that policy. The U.S. was a very American exceptionalist, imperialist kind of thinking, and the beacon of light, the shining city on the hill kind of thing. And when he wrote that, published it, then he went, they began to investigate him. And they scrubbed down all of his scholarship. Every book he wrote, every paper he had written, they looked at every footnote, and they were trying to get him to fire him, right? Because he was using his academic freedom to speak out against the colonization that had been happening in the Middle East that the U.S. was involved in. So, eventually his case ended up with the 8th Circuit Court in the U.S., and I was one of his expert witnesses. And because he had written about the use of smallpox, deliberate spreading of smallpox against Indigenous people. Well, I'm of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, and smallpox was spread among our people. So I was on a stand. They asked me, about it, and I said, yeah, there certainly is a history of that. People talked about it. It's an oral history, and then the attorney for the university said, well, where's it written down? I said, I just said it's an oral history, and but I can cite you a lot of people who have talked about it, which I did. So when I did, then they quickly moved out of that. They didn't want to talk about smallpox and the spreading of smallpox. So it's that particular article then is again looking at these icons of colonialism that exist. It also talked about how Native people, had been used as fodder in American imperialist wars for a long time. And then when they went out to war, like to Vietnam, their land was being taken, so they went out to fight for the U.S. When they came back, more land was being taken, so their bodies, their minds were being used and exploited for expansionism by the United States. So these are critiques that we were talking about, but they were very hard to bring into social work. They had much more, appeal to Indigenous studies and critical studies. But I thought this is what we're missing in social work, and that's kind of what my mission has been, is to kind of decolonize social work. Oh, let's see. Why was I going to talk about resilient coping? I'm not sure. I think when decolonizing social work works, and when we're working with people and we're restoring land, when we're restoring culture, when truth and reconciliation is not about land acknowledgements. To me, that's what settler colonialism would call, it would be like moving away from the center of what needs to be done, right? And not really operationalizing and doing what needs to be done, like returning the land. So those are big things that, it's one of my critiques of land acknowledgements. And I said, well, we're on the territory of so-and-so and whatever. And I said, well, that's fine. Land that belonged to them, that's fine. When are you going to return it? That's the thing. That's kind of become now with young folks. I'm just reading some papers and essays that young people have been publishing about, like, let's go beyond land claim, the land acknowledgement. We need to turn this into action again, right? So anyway, my point is that when we move in that direction, we have this resilient coping against colonialism. And I was just explaining before I came here to social workers at Algoma University. I did a presentation to them this morning. I said, when we're able to overcome the stresses of colonialism, I said this part of the brain, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, activates. It's pretty clear that's what's happening. And people have a healthier outcome. But until we begin to get these pieces together, to retrieve and to restore and have restoration of these different things, it's very difficult to do with the current kinds of models we're using in social work. So that's it. Thank you. So, I don't know if you have time for questions. I got
about 15 minutes, which is great.
Okay.
So we'll be happy to take questions. We have questions online already that have been filled out, but if there are any questions to start us in the room, I'll open it for a moment. If you'd like to start us off, that'd be great, and then I'll go to some questions online.
Sure. You mentioned about colonization of the mind. Was the early colonizers actively doing psychological colonization, as like, did they have all the textbooks how to do like a step-by-step colonizing guide to dominate the locals?
No, I don't know if they had a guide. Yeah, that's interesting.
Is it a symptom of the colonization?
Yeah, so the first part of your question is like, do they have a manual? I don't know, maybe they did, who knows? but things that they did actually, really begin to change neural networks in the brain. I've done a lot of research on neuroscience and include a lot of that image that I just showed. I do a lot of work on that. And that's why I use the term neurodecolonization, is like, how do we decolonize the mind? And so things you're talking about, change the way the wiring, in the brain is. Certain regions of the brain are activated, others are sort of silenced. Fear parts of the brain, like the amygdala, which is the fear part of the brain, becomes more active. When you're under oppression and when you're unsafe and when you feel threatened for long periods of time, gray matter in your brain, which is supposed to protect important parts of your brain, begins to thin out. The white matter in your brain, that's about connectivity, that begins to kind of thin out as well. So other parts of the brain, like self-compassion, that would end up in a place called the anterior cingulate cortex of the brain, those begin to kind of quiet down. So the fear part of the brain then becomes more and more active. The hypothalamus, which is like being aware, becomes kind of overactivated too as well. And there's a lot of neurochemistry that takes place. One of the things that happens is that chemicals like epinephrine, which is an alert chemical, begins to go up. Cortisol, which is like adrenaline-like, you got to stay alert, otherwise something bad's going to happen, goes up. That's very similar to what a person faces when they face trauma. But if you can imagine that on a long-term basis happening to kids when they're brought into a school very early, and they have to go through, and every day they're told, they're savages, they have to change their clothes, they can't speak their language because it's a savage language. Those kinds of things stay in the memory because in memory work, what we know from the science is that the first thing we do with the memory is we have to encode it. The sight, the sound, the smell, the taste, the touch, which is why survivors of residential school may go back to see an old residential school and everything comes back because it's encoded, right? The sight of that place, the sound of that place, is all there because what they've done is consolidate that memory into one feeling. All that action goes into one feeling. It's a consolidation. The next part of memory work is the storage of that. So it ends up in the hippocampus for long term. It's always there to draw from whenever that stimuli comes. Then they feel a sense of like grief and trauma. And then that retrieval is the last part, right? 4 things: encoding, consolidation, storage, and that retrieval. Every time that's brought up, every time they're exposed to that, the retrieval results in that. So you don't have to have a manual. All you have to do is do these things to people to encode that message into the brain, that they're inferior, that they're savage, lazy, that their language is primitive, and those kinds of things. And then you take them out of the books, and you take them out of the history, and you put it with all settlers. Then you say, okay, then the brain encodes that. It consolidates it, it stores it, and then you have to retrieve it, right? So that's the piece about memory and how that works. So there really wasn't a manual, but it's just the treatment. It happens in prisons, people who are in prison camps, people who are, being held, and imprisoned by others, abductions, those kinds of things. It's a very similar process that happened to those kids in residential school, or even Indigenous people that end up in prison or incarcerated. So.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions online that we'll go to next, and they're both related to academia and methodology, so we'll kind of go down that road a little bit before coming back into the room. So the first question, how do we quantify our successes in the decolonization process, or can we only see success through qualitative means?
Oh, you can do both. I'm working with my colleague in a room here, Dr. Mohammed Khan, professor in our faculty. We were working on a decolonization equation. Linear equation for decolonization with values based upon a number of factors. I was trained as a quantitative researcher, and so was my colleague, my PhD program. So we believe that, if there are social things that exist, or psychological things that exist, or things of oppression that exist, we identify those things, we give them a value, we weight those values, and we come up with a probability about what level of decolonization that can happen. That's new work. That was originally my work. I don't think anyone's ever done that kind of work before, but that's where my brain goes after midnight. It starts working on equations and formulas, things I don't get a chance to do in the day. But yes, we certainly can do that. We can certainly conceptualize, an analytical equation for that, and give it a value and estimate the probability of decolonization based upon language or land restoration or whatever it is. And you can quantify that and give it a weighted value, 1 through 5 or whatever, like a Likert scale. So.
Super, and I'll take one more. I'll read one more from online, just so people that are hearing this online. I'm Jason Brennan from the Morrow Institute. So these are not my questions. These are questions that have come to us online. And the second question that I'll read is, how has the Academy in your different posts reacted to your scholarship having an advocacy component, dare I say an activist application?
I think they tiptoe sometimes. And one of the things is that, we're kind of a rare breed in the Academy, Indigenous scholars, and even more rare when I was first starting. People want you on the faculty, but I think most of the social work faculties I've been on have been very good in terms of supporting the scholarship. The students, on the other hand, have been in my experience kind of mixed. So I think that in itself, in the States, I haven't been a professor here at Manitoba, but in the States it was very mixed because a lot of students thought I was was too political. They thought I hated the United States. They thought I hated white people. And I would get my evaluations back, and then I would visit with the dean about that. And the dean was very good. He says, keep on doing what you're doing, right? And that was very good, I think. So, but when I mentioned Ward Churchill, I was a director of a big Indigenous studies center down at the University of Kansas. And I was supporting Ward. I was one of his key witnesses. And I felt that was part of my work as a scholar, too, to kind of, because I was trying to protect his academic freedom. Well, I got ostracized and by the administration and so on. And when you go and you look at the University of Kansas, you can't find too much of the evidence of me on their website anymore. They start pulling some of the stuff off, which was fine, But I was the director of that program. They recruited me. And after that experience, I said, whenever anyone else is going to hire me, I said, have you read my CV? Have you read my articles? You sure you want me to come and be at your university? So that's kind of one of the things, kind of prep them, like, it's like I don't, as a professor, I don't walk lightly. I speak, the truth, and I speak, very directly and clearly too, colonization. So it's been mixed, it's been difficult, but it's, as you know, that a lot of professors during the war on terrorism in the United States under George Bush, a lot of scholars underwent, they became the focus of the country, because they were unpatriotic at that point. I'm disappointed I didn't make the top 100, but I was certainly mentioned a number of times. And my work also went to supporting Leonard Peltier, who was a political prisoner of the United States. He was an Anishinaabe, a Dakota man, very famous case. I supported him, and of course that I got a lot of blowback from that, and even got, one of my top fans was the FBI, so and that was fine. That's the kind of work that I was doing as a professor. So it's, it's the kind of thing I believe as an Indigenous professor dealing with what we deal with, you just can't play it safe. You've got to do what I think you were trained to do, which is speak truth to power. So.
In the room, the fellow with the cap, and please use a good strong voice so everyone on the line can hear you.
Thanks. Thanks for speaking to us. I was curious, you spoke about Indigenous sovereignty that are really important. I'm just curious, what does that look like to you? Also, in terms of allyship, what is allyship to you? What is good allyship?
Yeah, so I think good allyship, I'll start with that, I think occurred in Standing Rock in 2016. I don't know if any of you remember Standing Rock or even heard about it, but Standing Rock was a big, big global event in the United States where, I remember the name of the oil company, was trying to build a pipeline across the territory of the Lakota people in Standing Rock. It's a big deal, right? And because they wouldn't build it north of the city of Bismarck because it had a spill, it would pollute the water of all the people in Bismarck, which was the big city that was north of the reservation, right? So, because the water flows south. And so the pressure was on the government, the federal government, and from the state government, and all these citizens, all these white citizens, they said, we don't want it built here, build it further south. So they were trying to build it further south, which would go across the lands of the Lakota people. And if it broke, it would pollute all their lands and all their water. It wouldn't pollute people up north who were largely settlers, right? So the movement then began. And people from all over the world showed up. A lot of allies showed up. Palestinian people, Irish, French, all the different tribal folks, and all these different people were down there, Mark Ruffalo was down there, Joan Baez, Cornel West, all these really important, prominent leaders were there, supporting Indigenous people and their land rights. So there was a lot of great allies there because they realized that the more the oil companies got their way, it was going to not stop there with Indigenous people. It's going to continue to affect the rest of the world as they continue to pollute, and warm the climate to a boiling point. So that's the first part. I think that was a really good example. If you haven't ever heard of it, I really encourage you to look it up. There's a lot of film, there's a lot of photo essay, there's a lot written about Standing Rock, and about the pipeline down there. And the first part of your question was
Indigenous sovereignty.
oh yeah. What does land look like? I think Indigenous people are much like what's going on in the United States right now. There's a restoration of national parks going on. I think Indigenous people would like to see a restoration like that happening, where the relationship they had with the rivers, they had with the animals, they had with the lands, would be restored, it would be cleaned up, right? And that they would be able to kind of use that for sacred sites. They would be able to use it for economic purposes. They would be able to use it, in their daily lives and that kind of thing. So I think that's the key thing about it, is the restoration of those lands for the purposes they want to use them for. Now, don't get me wrong. I know there's a lot of people in the States that have built casinos on their lands, right? So that's not something you did before. And I'm saying, well, it's one of those things, the economy, they were forced into this kind of economy with the U.S. So it's like overcoming colonization through decolonization is very difficult. How are you going to live, if you don't have the resources to build homes or build schools or build, health centers and that kind of thing, right? It's mixed into the economy here with the larger economy. So I think that's something that folks are still kind of thinking about in terms of how do we do that, And I think that there's a lot of planning going on right now. So whether or not that happens is a totally different question.
Dr. Muller has a question, and then we might have time for one more depending.
It's just I was struck by some of your references and interested in them, Angela Davis, Black Panthers, AIM, and so on, Frantz Fanon. And I guess I'm wondering about your thoughts on the role of violence as a technique or a tool of decolonization. For Fanon, violence was both inevitable and a consequence of colonial violence, right? Just redirected back at the colonizers. So where are you at with that?
Well, I think, I'm a peace-loving guy. I believe in peace. I believe in compassion. History has a different story, though, and I've studied violence, and I've looked at violence even to ancient wars in the Bible. We're at St. Paul's here, so if you know your Old Testament, you know how many times God gave the order to wipe out this group or that group or this group or that group, right? Millions of people. One of the books I was reading about, the God's Sword of Blood or whatever it is, I forget the title, that God had ordered the killing of, according to the Bible, like 60 million people, right? You know how many people Satan killed in the Old Testament? Probably about 50 people. Right? But this is the violence that goes back, way back, even further, thousands of years, where paleopathologists have found places where ancient people have decimated another group over land, over water, whatever it is, right? Way, even past the age of agriculture way back when, and those things still turn up. So when I've looked at the research, do we have a gene for violence? We do have, aggressive genes. We do have aggressive chemistry in our body. Those are survival mechanisms, right? You can look at evolutionary biology. The toughest wins that you get back to thinking about the survival of the fittest, right? So there's that piece there. The more active part of the brain has been around the amygdala for about 300 million years. Fight, flight, fear, feeding, fornication, the 5 Fs that neuroscientists talk about. That's about 300 million years of doing that. Only over the last 15 million years have we developed neurons of compassion in our brain and caring, right? Where we can feel it for other people. And this part of our brain that's 300 million years old is a fallback. It's easier for us to go into violence and into resistance, into fighting and that sort of thing. A case example would be the Arawak people in the Caribbean islands. Peace-loving people, didn't even know violence. They traded with all the other indigenous groups on the islands. When Christopher Columbus came there, they had no weapons. They are so ignorant about weapons that they cut themselves with his swords, right? And what did he say? You read his journals. He says, wow, with only 50 men, I could conquer this whole place here, which he did, because they had nothing to fight back. They were pacifists. They were peace-loving people. Read about it, right? When you read about it's like, wow, you know, they didn't have anything. And this is the kind of thing I think that exists, you know, in the world of you know, all beings, right? There's this kind of constant struggle of violence going on. Now, is it important in decolonization? I can only think of the resistance that happened with the Black Panthers, the American Indian movement, and the Civil Rights movement. Violence was involved there. And then I'll fast forward to George Floyd. It wasn't until people got onto the streets and violently protested his death that some of these monikers of hate started coming down. Some of these labels of you know, racism started to be crumbled. You know, all these people that are in these boards of directors, these companies and corporations, they all knew better, but they did not want to remove them because there was a lot of pressure from the outside. And only after that happened did they start to change, after that violence. You know, Occupy Wall Street, if you remember that movement, that was a peaceful movement. All these people went out, they were meditating in New York and all over the place. Police came in there, they pepper sprayed them, they beat them. They all went home and never came back. They were trying to change the economic system. They used peaceful methods. They were beaten down. Now, I'm not saying I agree with violence or not agree with violence. I'm just telling you the history that the piece that I know, and some of the science that I know, and some of the evolutionary history that exists. It's going to take a while for us to generate that kind of level of harmony and peace and collaboration and compassion. It starts at a very early age, we know, when we look at, you know, different, you know, brain imaging slides, that when we start to integrate those kinds of compassionate practices, right? It's very important. One of the key things, another thing I'll say too, is that I've studied, you know, also looking at God in terms of like, you know, who was supposed to be, you know, who a lot of people look up to, and of course, or folks, you know, look up to. And research that's been done in the States, at least, has kind of shown that there are 4 fundamental gods that exist that people believe in. There's a critical God, there's a distant God, and then there's the God of retribution. That's kind of, you know, Old Testament stuff still coming into now. The other God is the God of benevolence and kindness. It says, love everybody, care about everybody, be compassionate, be peaceful. Unfortunately, only about 25% of the people believe in that God. Most of the other people believe in this distant God that says, it's your free will, go at it. Or like, well, I'm watching you, I'm very critical, or like, boy, wait till your time comes, I'm going to roast you and burn you in hell forever, right? That's the kind of, I mean, that's survey research, big survey catchment research that catches a lot of these folks' attitudes. So it's complex when you think about that, you know. Is God, you know, right now willing wars that are happening in the Middle East against Palestine or Ukraine, or is there a will again, you know, the people that have free will, you know, a free will God, you know, to starve in Somalia or places like that? I mean, those are really deep questions. So I just kind of banking on, you know, I'm not cherry picking, I hope, but looking at different parts of it. So, but I would be interested in what other people think too as well, because I don't want to be the only guy. No, violence is kind of embedded in our genes. I'd like to know if someone says, no, it's not. You know, I mean, I practiced meditation for a long time with Buddhists and so on, and they believe that humans are basically good. You just have to find that place. And, so it takes a long time to find that place. You know, so.
Yeah, so I guess we've come to the, I know there are other questions. If Michael has some time, perhaps he could deal with them informally, but out of respect for the folks who are sort of sitting in online, and for those of you who have other commitments today, I'd like to thank Michael Yellowbird for his fascinating talk and overview today. Thank you so much for coming.